Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'm Kevin Stayton, Chief Curator at the Brooklyn Museum, and I'm delighted that everyone could come to this symposium, which I think is going to be a really wonderful day here at Brooklyn, and tomorrow another day at the Met. I'm delighted to see so many of our Brooklyn Project alums in the audience, and we want to give you a sense of what this project was about and where we're going from here. The reason for this symposium is really twofold. It's first to celebrate these two wonderful exhibitions drawn from the Brooklyn Museum costume collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. American High Style, Fashioning a National Collection, is the exhibition that you will see here at the Brooklyn Museum. You'll see it later on today. You'll have several opportunities to do that. And also American Woman, Fashioning a National Identity, which is the exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, which I hope you will see tomorrow if you haven't already seen it. These two exhibitions together, I think, really reveal the astonishing quality and depth of the Brooklyn Museum collection, this collection that was in formation for over 100 years here at the Brooklyn Museum. The second reason for the symposium, the underlying reason, and indeed the reason for the exhibitions in the first place, is to celebrate this new collaboration between the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Brooklyn Museum in the establishing of this innovative collection sharing plan. In January of 2009, after a lot of thought and a lot of examination of the collection, the Brooklyn Museum consolidated the collections with the Met by transferring to them our collection of costumes. These were transferred to the Met with the agreement that the Brooklyn Museum retains the right to exhibit them in our galleries whenever we need to do so. So ultimately, we have as much access to them as we had previously, and in fact, we will be able to use them more than we were able to do before because of the care that they will get at the Met. I also want to give you an overview of the day that you will have here at the Brooklyn Museum so that you'll have a sense of what it is we're going to do. Beginning very shortly, Harold and I will come to the stage together, and I will talk a little bit about the process of thinking through this transfer, and Harold will talk a little bit about the reasons why this was a perfect collection to come to the Metropolitan. We will each talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then there will be time for questions from the audience about what we think of as a really innovative plan for this collection. Next, Jan Reeder will speak about the review process itself. Before we made this transfer, we spent 3 years, more than 3 years, looking very carefully at our costume collection and ultimately finding out more about it than we had ever known before. And Jan will walk us through that process and tell us all about it. Lunch will then happen. You'll have an opportunity at the lunch break to go to the exhibition on your own. And then at 1:30, lunch will be followed by a gallery talk given by Jan Reeder of American High Style. We reconvene here in the auditorium at 2:30 for a series of shortish talks given by the staff who led and participated in the costume review, and they will talk a bit about what they learned during that process. They'll talk about it both in terms of the practical logistics of how what we believe is a really sort of method-setting costume review was done, and also about the things that they learned from the collection when they did that. Elizabeth Fiorentino will speak about the logistics of doing this really intensive survey and study of the collection. Grace Hernandez will speak about labels and the great shops in Fulton Street. It's really interesting that the off-site storage facility in which this examination took place was right in the middle of downtown Brooklyn, where all of the great department stores used to be. So it was a wonderful vantage point to see the collection and to see where some of it came from, at least, these great stores in old downtown Brooklyn. Michelle Murphy was one of the great movers of the costume collection when it was at its most vital. And Katie Netherton will speak about Michelle Murphy, this wonderful and somewhat forgotten woman who was the head of the costume design lab for a number of years. And then Jessica Crick will speak about a group of objects that came from the Prince family. One of the great discoveries in the examination of this collection was a group of material that came from the Prince family, really some of the highlights of the collection, and we'll learn a little bit about that. And finally, I think one of the really most touching and moving stories that the costume collection revealed is that of the Gratitude Train, this group of dolls that came to the museum after World War I from the people of France, and Jessica Rail will speak about that. These are brief conversations, and I hope that during this afternoon session you'll hold your questions, and then at the end of them all of the participants will come to the stage and there'll be an opportunity for questions. So that's the order of the day, and we will begin with Harold and I speaking about the collection and the transfer process that we went through. At this time, I would like to ask Harold to come on to the stage. Harold, as I'm sure all of you know, is the curator in charge of the Costume Institute, and he has been since 2000, 10 years now. He is sort of ex officio, one of the style setters of New York from this job. Over the course of the time that he's been there, he has produced many wonderful exhibitions from the Costume Institute, among them Goddess, The Classical Mode, Dangerous Liaisons, Fashion and Furniture in the 18th Century, Extreme Beauty, The Body Transformed, and Model as Muse, whose publication has just won a gold medal from the Independent Publishers Association. Harold has been a wonderful colleague in this process. It's been a great pleasure to work with him and to get to know him better. His wry intelligence brings a new sort of perspective to everything, as you will see when we talk about what we have done and what we intend to do. So I'm going to move over to the chairs and begin with my presentation, and then we'll move into Harold's.
Thank you.
In 1893, let me get situated here. In 1893, the people of Brooklyn began what was conceived of as the biggest museum in the world, based on architectural plans of McKean White. And they begun this in the middle of empty fields between what had been the old village of Brooklyn and the old village of Flatbush. That's the building we're in right now. And on the screen is a representation from the McKean White studio of what this building would have been like had it been completed. It would have been 6 times the size that it is now. And it was this enormous plan for bringing culture to the middle of Brooklyn. One of the amazing things to me is that when they began building this building in 1893, after McKean White had won this architectural competition, there were 17 paintings in the collection. So, after having conceived of the largest museum of the world with 17 paintings, they went on a major shopping spree. So that for the next number of decades, enormous quantities of materials were brought into the museum. We recently had an exhibition of the Tissot watercolors for the New Testament, acquired in 1900 by public subscription. The people of Brooklyn got together and in a few months raised $60,000, which at the time was an enormous amount of money, for this collection of watercolors that came into the collection. This was paralleled by aggressive collection building in many fields, and through donations as the building was being built. And here are some views of the building going up, as you can see, with nothing much around it. This is the building as it existed in 1896 when they first opened it to the public. And this by the early, right around World War II. The front facade And most of what you see today, with its grand staircase, which I have to say was twice as tall as the staircase at the Met before it was taken down in 1934. So this great building could swallow up enormous collections, and we collected in many fields. I set the stage for this discussion of the Brooklyn Museum's costume collection with this history because I think it's impossible to understand the meaning and use of the collection in the present without a sense of where it came from and why it exists. The collections that were begun in that period of American optimism when everything seemed possible. America was joining the sort of brotherhood of great nations and needed to establish cultural institutions that would fit in with that. As the first yearbook stated after the building began, and I quote, "It was felt that Brooklyn should have an Institute of Arts and Sciences worthy of her wealth, her position, her culture, and her people," end quote. As the director of the time, Franklin Hooper, said at the laying of the cornerstone, this collection should embrace, and again I quote, "all known human history, the infinite capacity of man to act, to think, to love, and the many departments of science and art which he has developed. Through its collection in the arts and sciences and through its libraries, it should be possible to read the history of the world." So this was no small plan that they were putting together at the beginning of the 20th century. The costume collection, and when the costume collection began, this was not specifically an art museum. This was an Institute of Arts and Sciences. This photograph on the screen shows what may be, in fact, the gallery that the costumes are in now, or it may be the gallery just below it, but you can see that it was a gallery of natural history, and the museum was collecting all kinds of material. The museum's mission was to serve every field and every purpose, and to provide Brooklyn with a place for study and self-improvement, as it had done since its founding as the Apprentices' Library in 1823. The earliest recorded costume to enter the collection came in 1903. However, it was the onset of World War I that was really the impetus for the first major spurt of collection growth. Under the legendary curator Stuart Cullen, who you see here, who joined the staff in 1903 as the curator of ethnology, but who was such a Renaissance man that he couldn't keep his fingers out of other things as well, and M.D.C. Crawford of Fairchild Publications' Women's Wear Daily, the Brooklyn Museum responded to the sudden hiatus of the flow of designs from Paris at the beginning of the war by establishing a study collection for the inspiration of designers in the vital New York garment industry. Cullen said, "What these industries need in this critical time is an opportunity to study the basic source of inspiration. The time has come when they must do what designers of other great cities in the past have always done, go back to the basic source of inspiration and follow their own inspirations derived from the material in the terms of their own times and people. This is the only way in which art has ever found its way into industry." So, like the Victorian Albert more than a half century earlier, the Brooklyn Museum set about collecting in order, in many ways, to advance national industry. By 1918, there was a study room at the Brooklyn Museum devoted to this material, and that eventually grew into the museum's industrial division. And I'll show you some illustrations here of how design and industry were allied at this period. In 1923, the Brooklyn Museum held one of the first exhibitions of African art, and reputedly the first exhibition of African art that looked at African art as an aesthetic quantity rather than as an ethnic quantity. And here from I believe it's the Post in 1923, Women's Wear Daily, I'm sorry, in 1923, an illustration of some costumes or some fashion available at Bonwitz based on African textiles at the Brooklyn Museum. Over the years, the collection and its care was reconfigured in a number of ways as the Industrial Design Division, as part of the Decorative Arts Division, as an independent department, as the Blum Design Lab, which was founded by the Blum family of Abraham and Straus and Federated Department Stores, and back again, always attracting astonishing masterpieces along the way. Since the collection began as a study collection for use in an institution that was not yet an art museum, and which had seemingly unlimited space, the collection, in addition to these masterpieces, also attracted examples of the most mundane and utilitarian kind of material as well. In 1934, something happened that would have a major impact on the future of the collection. In the most profound redefinition in its history, the Brooklyn Museum decided to become an art museum. And also, at the same time, was very interested in becoming a more public institution. So the natural history collections that we saw before were sent away to other institutions, and other collections that didn't fit into the definition of an art museum were either sent away or redefined. The costumes made the cut, they were redefined as part of the art collections, and the costume collection was retained. Nonetheless, the costume collection continued to be used as much as a library, and we saw that here, as in the 21st century sense of a museum collection. Costumes were made available to designers and students for study, and sometimes they were even worn, something that gives us a bit of a chill when we see it now. But in fact, modern perspectives of collection care and use hadn't begun yet to change our attitudes towards these objects. However, it soon did, and professional standards began to progress. The tens of thousands of works in the costume collection, in light of this, became more and more difficult to manage according to our own evolving standards. Works that had entered the collections as study objects to be stashed in full drawers and then used became works of art that happened to be made of textile, a particularly fragile and demanding material with costly restrictions in storage and exhibition. Storage facilities that had been state-of-the-art when they were created in the 1970s were, by the early 21st century, so outdated that as professionals we could not tolerate them. And here you see one of our storerooms that had been created in the 1970s using what was considered an ingenious system of dry cleaners racks, so that the costumes were all hanging on these racks, and you pressed a button originally and the racks revolved and brought you the costume you wanted. Seemed like a good idea in 1971, seemed like a very bad idea in 2001. Our standards for the way costumes were exhibited had also risen just as dramatically, and we could only, by this point, put costumes on display for short periods of time. At the same time this dry cleaner's rack was done for storage, the museum had a system that was a conveyor belt that went by a glass window, and the costumes sort of tottered out on their mannequins, constantly moving, constantly under light, in a way that, again, we find a little bit appalling now, but was state-of-the-art at the time it was done. Here are some other early costume exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum. By the end of the 20th century, we had, in fact, professionalized ourselves out of the costume business as we had done it before, and because of rising costs and because of changing standards, this had led to moratoriums on display and on deferrals on maintenance. During a fiscal crisis in 1990, the Brooklyn Museum Department of Costumes and Textiles was closed, and the collection was merged with the Department of Decorative Arts, whose curators were its caretakers. Strong efforts were made for several years to revive and use the collection. A specialist curator was hired, exhibitions, some of them quite successful, were initiated, and funds were sought to keep the collection moving forward. But at every step, the challenges of dealing with such an enormous and old collection in a professional way were disillusioning. When the curator left for other opportunities in 2004, the museum's board decided that it was time to address the long-simmering issue of what was the most responsible way to deal with the future of this great, if underused, collection. The first problem, though, was that we didn't really know what we had. Over the years, the collection had grown organically, and much of it had entered the museum before modern cataloging techniques were in place. Because of its enormous size and difficult storage condition, no comprehensive inventory or cataloging project had ever been attempted. We had good information about parts of the collection and almost no information about other parts of the collection. We had the internal mythology that this was a fabulous collection, but its exact shape and scope was not entirely clear. So the first step then was to find out what we had. Luckily, this need corresponded with an initiative by the Mellon Foundation to assist museums in addressing long-term financial health and issues surrounding long-term financial health, and solving problems that drained resources. The Mellon Foundation, and more specifically Angelica Rudenstein, recognized that the future of the Brooklyn Museum costume collection presented just such an issue, and that in addition, it was an important national asset as well as an asset to the Brooklyn Museum. Also recognizing that knowing that what we had was an essential first step in finding out how to use the collection, either at Brooklyn or elsewhere, the foundation awarded us nearly $4 million for a 3-year inventory, photography, and cataloging project. For 3 years, a staff of around 10 people working at a location off-site and including art handlers, catalogers, conservator, and photographer systematically reviewed the collection, cataloging each piece, photographing it, and determining which one of 3 categories it fell into: masterpiece, museum quality, or not museum quality, because of its quality or condition. And I'll show you some illustrations of this going on. Jan may show you more of these. This is the collection being moved out of the museum. It was in such inconvenient storerooms that we had to cut a hole in the ceiling and ferry some of these costumes down to get them out of that storeroom. Things being packed, shoes being palletized, moved from the Brooklyn Museum to an off-site storage space where they were then restored and then examined, cataloged, photographed, and cared for. The result was that for the first time, the collection is fully documented, and we have a clear idea of its scope. It's huge, but not quite as big as we thought it was before we started, and its quality. It was indeed one of the world's great collections, but with its greatest quality concentrated in less than half of its number. At this point, several alternatives for the collection were readily apparent. The first and preferred course was, naturally, to retain the collection for Brooklyn and to care for it and program it as it deserved. We devised a capital budget and an ongoing operating budget for this option in order to address its feasibility, and the result was a figure that was simply not possible to incorporate into the ongoing Brooklyn Museum budget. We then discussed raising an endowment that would allow us to do that. And the ongoing budget of properly caring for and exhibiting costumes, in addition to the capital budget that would be required to get us up to speed to begin with, was multiple tens of millions of dollars, and again, was simply not feasible for us to do. At the same time, we determined that if we could not use the collection, it really was irresponsible to put it away again and let it remain in deferred maintenance and deferred use the way we had done before. The next consideration was to deaccession the collection, to sell it, and to use the funds to further the collecting goals of the Brooklyn Museum, which are many, in areas other than costumes and textiles. While this had a clear appeal, we realized that the collection was extremely important and that it was more important as a collection than the individual objects that made it up, that we had a responsibility to the collection as a whole, and that the public really needed to retain this in the public sphere, in the public domain, and our board readily agreed with that the option of selling it was really not worth breaking up the collection. That brought us to the final and more interesting solution to this problem: the transfer of the collection to another institution and the consolidation of this collection with another great collection. The mission of the Brooklyn Museum is to create a bridge between our great art collections and the public who ultimately own them and use them. This could be accomplished, we imagined, without the literal and traditional ownership by the Brooklyn Museum. At the same time, we were exploring new ways to use our own collections, to break down the barriers between collections and to use materials in new and different ways, to pay less attention to who the internal expert in the museum was, or what the collection, what collection the object was assigned to within the museum, and more attention to how the object was perceived by the public when it's on exhibition. And we knew that the public always responds to costumes with excitement. They're good ways to tell stories and to interpret many of the kinds of ideas we want to use at the museum. So we hope to find a solution in which we could retain the use of the costume collection without necessarily retaining the ownership of it. In other words, we wanted to establish a collaboration in which the Brooklyn Museum would contribute an astonishing fashion collection, and a partner would provide us with access to it for the public good. There are not many museums in America who collect costumes, and fewer in New York State. Of those who do, not many could contemplate the enormous commitment of adding the Brooklyn Museum collection to their own. But those who could were immediately responsive because of the tremendous opportunity that this idea presented. We found that potential partners were eager to accommodate our needs and to promise future use of the collection to Brooklyn in return for the addition to their own collections. Ultimately, and after much deliberation, our board based their decision that our costume dovetailed best with the Met's collection, and the Met had the long-term stability and financial well-being to be the best prospective adoptee of this material, and we were pleased to enter into this agreement with the Met. I have to say, it's always difficult for a curator to give up a collection. It's not what we do. We are acquirers. We're sort of preservers and keepers rather than dispersers. So I don't pretend that there aren't times that I still have pangs that I wish this could have stayed here. But in fact, I am really extremely proud of the decision that was reached by the board and staff of the Brooklyn Museum. The partnership that we have established allows Brooklyn to use this great collection, and in fact gives us greater access to it than we had before, when we didn't know what we had and that we could not afford, and when we could not afford to program it, to conserve it, to store it in the way it deserves. But more importantly, I think this creates a secure future for these great objects, this enormously important collection, and it allows them to be preserved and interpreted and exhibited to the public, who are, in fact, the ultimate owners of this collection. So that is the thinking that the museum and our board of trustees went through in the decision to go into this collaborative arrangement with the Met. And I think Harold will talk about the decision that the process of the decision that the Met made in accepting it.
Yes. I think everyone in the field has been following the transformation of this process, beginning with, I think, the extraordinary transparency in doing this complete assessment of the collection, which it was a formidable project, and Jan, of course, is going to, and her team are going to enumerate many of the challenges, but also the extraordinary success in that particular process. By the time it came to the Met, once the agreements were made, and I'm jumping ahead because I'm going to give you a little background about how I think the collections knit in, but by the time it came to the Met, it wasn't as if there was complete compatibility in terms of the database, or that organizational systems were completely aligned to the ones that we use at the Metropolitan Museum. But because it had been staged in such an extraordinary way, it really made it possible that within a year, this very complex, over 24,000 pieces, this very complex collection, all completely cataloged and photographed, which is astonishing that it was accomplished in just a little bit over 3 years, that it made it possible to merge the collections in a way that was possible for our institution. One of the challenges as we began negotiating with the Brooklyn Museum was, as a curator, of course, I had seen little glimpses of the Brooklyn collection. Of course, I, as many of us in this room, coveted them. But it's one thing to say that the collection is great and we want it. It's another thing to convince the administrators, the people who actually are responsible for the bottom line, for its ongoing preservation and display and interpretation, that the people who are responsible for that financial underpinning of this kind of partnership, that was the big challenge for us. It was less the problem of saying this is a worthy collection. It was, how are you going to do it? And I'm going to allude to that a little bit in what I'm presenting. I'm going to give you a brief history of the Costume Institute. The Costume Institute core collection was formulated as a performance costume, real historic costumes being collected by the neighborhood playhouse for actual productions of, actual theatrical productions. And this had begun in the 1920s. By the mid-1930s, the people who were involved in it, Irene Lewison, her sister Alice Lewison Crowley, and several costume designers, including Lee Simonson and Aileen Bernstein, decided that much of the material that they were using for these productions were of enough historical importance that they shouldn't be subjected to that kind of wear and tear, that these were objects that should be preserved. Though the collection was primarily of Western fashion, we have this one photograph in our archives that is of that point where they made the decision that they were going to create another entity, that it was no longer going to be stuff for productions, but rather a collection that was seen curatorially and museologically. At that moment, in 1937, they formed something called the Museum of Costume Art. The Museum of Costume Art was intended to preserve this collection. It had a small component of ethnographic and regional costumes, which you see here, worn by some of the people who were the biggest movers and shakers of the project. But it didn't have a permanent home. At one point, it was situated in storage areas of Saks Fifth Avenue. Because it didn't have a permanent home, the Lewison sisters, together with the other theater supporters, decided that they would work with the fashion community to find it a permanent situation. Over a 5-year period, with people as prominent as Dorothy Shaver from Lord & Taylor and Andrew Goodman of Bergdorf Goodman, and the doyen of American publicists, fashion publicists, Eleanor Lambert, entered into negotiations with the Metropolitan Museum of Art for space. It took almost 10 years. I mean, of course, the war intervened. It took almost 10 years before an agreement was made, and it was predicated on the idea that the fashion community would support the collection within the larger institution. Now, this is critical both to some of the nature of our operating strategies, as well as the possibility of having this partnership with the Brooklyn Museum. It's critical to that. So in 1946, the Museum of Costume Arts merged with, or physically took its place in our footprint, our current footprint at the Met, and was renamed the Costume Institute, with the understanding that the fashion community would support it. Well, in the initial elation of finding it a home, of course, there was some support, but very quickly it became clear that the annual operating expenses really needed to be subsidized. So Eleanor Lambert came up with the idea of something called the Party of the Year, and in the beginning, you could get tickets for $75. They're now $10,000 a seat. I mean, it's transformed, but it's because of that requirement on the part of the museum that the fashion communities support the department, that we have this annual fundraiser. And it began in 1947, and here you see an invitation for 1948. Not incompatible with the strategy of the Brooklyn Museum and the Design Laboratory, the Costume Institute really did encourage design study from the fashion community. They were the supporters of the collection, and so they were also the prime movers and users of the collection. As with the Brooklyn collection, there were certain ways of engaging with the collection that are no longer considered kosher, but it was something that had to evolve over a number of decades. At the beginning, there was much more direct use. Slowly, it began to be much more focused on scholarly research, increasingly fewer design groups and designers coming in, and increasingly scholars and students. The collection itself, though, from the very beginning, whatever its formation mission was, I mean, in terms of dressing these theatrical events, as soon as it came to the Metropolitan, the curators began to see it as something that was analogous to the other curatorial departments, and that collections should be focused on the great aesthetic manifestations of any particular era. And so from the beginning, there was an expansion of extraordinary 18th century dresses. By the mid-19th century and the late 19th century, when you have important designer labels, the focus became on provenance, on who made it, the idea of the artist as well as the art object. Here you see some Worths and another house of Worth. And because, and I really do think this is because we started our collection in the mid-20th century, and the Brooklyn began its collection in the early 20th century, there's something to be said about convenience. And so the donor pool that I think would have continued to direct their extraordinary fashion works to the Brooklyn Museum suddenly shifted. I think there was just an ease of being in the neighborhood. And so the Costume Institute really benefited in the 1950s and 60s by a wave of donations of important clients of the couture. And because of that, we have extraordinary collections of Balenciaga, Dior, Madame Grey, which have allowed us to do monographic shows really basically with our own material. And that's because of that, what I believe is that shift of donors who previously would have gone to the design lab than focusing on the Metropolitan Museum. Within that selection of masterworks representing a timeline of history, there is, of course, another strand, which is about more quotidian dress, where we want to represent high fashion in the Western world, and not necessarily with the kind of elevated authorship that the previous pieces suggested. But despite that, it has always been the intention, and perhaps it's aberrational, but there were several people who were working in the department who were very Francophile, and they felt that the artistry of dress really resided in Paris. There were some exceptions, and for example, we have important Rudy Gernreichs, we have an important Giorgio de Sant'Angelo collection, wonderful Bonnie Cashin, comparable to the wonderful Bonnie Cashin collection that was in the Brooklyn holdings. But in fact, most of the material that was sought after was produced by the French and in the haute couture. So you would have something like this Madame Grey dress, which ended up in the collection, or of course this iconic Saint Laurent, the Modrian dress, which also ended up in the collection. Because of this focus on authorship, we have very full holdings of certain designers, Chanel, Saint Laurent, but there are eccentricities. I mean, and there are these lacunae in the collection that I think our partnership has bridged. For example, though our Saint Laurent collection is quite rich, we have a remarkable paucity of holdings of Elsa Schiaparelli. I mean, when I see what is in the Philadelphia Museum, I'm just salivating. It's such an extraordinary collection. But the Brooklyn collection, together with our collection, and I'm showing you a Saint Laurent that is not in the collection, but was inspired by this piece, which is in Jan's show, Les Yeux Elsa, and Schiaparelli's original astrological jacket, that by merging the two collections, we strengthen the Schiaparelli holdings of the Brooklyn Museum, and the Brooklyn Museum collection actually reinforces the very good but very small collection of Madame Gray that we have. But of course, the great collection that has been added to the Met collection is by the American designer Charles James. James, of course, was very much invested in the notion of the couturier practitioner as being an artist. He was the only designer to ever get a Guggenheim Fellowship. But within that, he also believed that it was necessary to revitalize the creativity of Seventh Avenue, which he really dismissed. And so he had this practice of approaching his clients to donate to the Brooklyn Museum. And as a consequence of that, there is a remarkable cache, not only of his dresses, but also of his sketches, some of which are in Jan's show, that provide an overview of perhaps the most important American couturier. I wouldn't say he was the most important American designer, but the most important American couturier, in a way that is a revelation about the artistic process. So if there is any one component that is the most compatible in the Brooklyn Museum collection with the Met's own approach, it would be the James collection. In addition to that, though, and Kevin has alluded to it, is that the Brooklyn collection has aspects of just workaday style. What we've decided is that there's going to be an inherently distinctive mission, because it's more or less static, I mean, that collection has been formed, that we're going to retain in this merger the essential DNA of the collection. And so despite the fact that the process of the evaluation rendered certain things to be deaccessioned and certain things to be studied for deaccessioning, what we've been, the luxury we've been given is the ability to think of this as a discrete collection in perpetuity. And this was part of the agreement with the Brooklyn, and it was very important to Dr. Lehman, the director of the museum, that the general public understood the historic nature of this collection. What's exciting about the two shows happening simultaneously here and at the Met is what Jan has been able to do is tease out so many of those strands of pieces, and you know, there were humorous moments when I walked through and she was introducing me to the ideas of her exhibition, and the Helen Cookman pieces are just sort of anathema to a Met method of collecting, and yet it's so intrinsic to the history of the Brooklyn collection. So that's a kind of way in which we're actually expanding the Met mission by having this Brooklyn component. When you go to Jan's show as well as to Andrew's show, you will see very different strategies of interpretation of dress. And what is exciting to us about this celebration of the partnership is in this symposium, what we're hoping to allude to isn't the endorsement of one interpretation or one kind of mission of collections or exhibition policies, but rather the fact that costume interpretation has become so wide, and the possibilities of different approaches have just expanded exponentially over the last 20 years, that there are all these different voices that are possible, not only in terms of developing collections, but in their exhibition and exposure. Today is really a red letter day for the Met in that we're able to share with the Brooklyn the excitement of a collection that really was seen only in fragments that is now going to be, and it already has been. It's on Art Store. I mean, a component of it has already been posted on the Art Store. We have it posted on the web. So there's a possibility already of a greater accessibility to the collection that I think was what was attractive to the Brooklyn and its administration, its curators, because that's what everybody wants. Everybody wants this incredible resource to be available to a much wider audience. Thank you.
I think we would be happy to take some questions. I have to say that I'm probably the single person in the room who knows the least about costumes, but I know something about the process here at the Brooklyn Museum, and Harold and I will both talk about that. Dallas.
Do you see the Met's collecting changing now that you have the Brooklyn Museum? You mentioned that Helen Cook was here.
No, I think we have to be true to our the Costume Institute has its own kind of mission, and that hasn't changed. I mean, even with Tom Campbell, he's basically, at least in my discussions with him, he seems to see our mission as unchanged. What's exciting, though, is that in a kind of bell jar way, the Brooklyn collection introduces a kind of depth of collecting that is different than ours. The other thing that's interesting about the process that we're going through, where we're now comparing objects from a category that Jan's team designated as important, interesting, potentially redundant, and we're measuring those things against pieces in our own collection. And we're finding that in many instances, the Brooklyn holdings are much stronger, so that it suggests that we'll be deaccessioning our pieces. In some instances, we have vastly better examples, and there is enough representation in the Brooklyn collection that we don't feel that it's transforming its identity. The one thing that we want to do is maintain the identity of the Brooklyn Museum collection. Roberta Smith in the New York Times sort of dug in a critique when she said, you know, it's so cumbersome to say the Brooklyn Museum collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But that is, in fact, how we perceive it, that it is a discrete body of material that can be searched, merged, but also has a kind of independence within our collection.
Is there any relationship between the Brooklyn Museum and the Metropolitan Museum and the Fashion Institute of Technology?
Well, I can say that there's a long relationship between the Brooklyn Museum and the Fashion Institute of Technology. FIT, when it was founded, was closely aligned to the Brooklyn Museum. What had been the Blum Design Lab at the Brooklyn Museum actually moved to FIT and is now the Blum Design Lab at FIT. In the early years, we shared collections with them when they were developing their collections. A lot of Brooklyn Museum material went there, both permanently and on long-term loan. Ultimately, over the course of the period from, I don't know, the 1970 to about 1990, they developed their own collections to the point that they no longer needed the material that the Brooklyn Museum had with them. Obviously, the FIT collection is one of the other great collections in New York City. Yeah.
Right. And that historic relationship, I think that it would be wonderful if FIT had the opportunity to participate, but it was a scheduling issue for them. But one of the things that was always floating in the back of our heads is that there is a historical linkage. I mean, the FIT collection would not exist without the Edward C. Blum Design Laboratory. In fact, the first person who directed that collection was Bob Riley, who had worked here as the person in charge of the design laboratory. And so when it shifted, there was a distinction, though, that was made even at that point, from my understanding of the Brooklyn Museum, is that they sent those pieces which were study pieces, so that they could be actively handled, used by students, turned inside out. You know, the 19th century bodice could be studied. And those pieces that they felt were irreplaceable and masterworks or of a high historic value remained here.
Right. It was one of those, I mentioned when I was speaking before that the Brooklyn Museum transformed within the museum the costume collection a number of times during its history. It started as a study collection. As the 20th century progressed, it became, at least at times, aligned with the other art collections and was considered an art collection. And it was at one of those moments when the Brooklyn Museum was really looking at this collection as an art collection, when the actual function of the design lab was no longer considered a major priority mission, that the design lab was transferred to FIT. And it seemed like the right kind of dual direction for the museum to keep the art part of the collection and for FIT to take up the study part of the collection.
I was brought from Haiti in 1972 to this great city of Brooklyn, and I've always considered this place my home. I graduated in 1975 after 3 years of high school without speaking any English. I had to learn English in 6 months and graduated in 3 years with more credits than I needed. And I moved away to Texas, where I'm now, and I'm back here visiting for my mother's funeral, which was yesterday. And my question was, this is quite coincidental, because I'm always asking myself, when I'm passing through the clothing or garment departments in stores, and I see all those clothes that people are fighting for. If you want something, somebody else always wants it more than you do. I don't know how many of you have gone shopping, but when you're looking at something and somebody's trying to pull it away from you, those were the days of Macy's when we used to go downtown Brooklyn and buying clothes. It may be a little bit different now. But my current feeling about clothing is always, when I pass through those stores, when is it going to be optional? When are we going back to those days when we never had to fight for clothes and just be the way we were born? And I would like the panel to say something about
business.
How do you guys feel about the trend of going back to how things used to be, without preserving too much of the past and remaining enclosed into a confined, like men, they have to wear ties all the time, it's like a noose. Don't you guys want to be liberated sometimes? And the fashion seems to be always geared towards women.
Well, I think we can answer the question, which is, one of the great things about clothing is that it's not only about keeping warm, it's not only about, being modest in a different social situation, it's also about communicating all of these other stories about yourself. So the more variation there is between us, it's actually more exciting, at least from my perspective, that if I see somebody who is wearing saggies, and then I see somebody who is dressed more conservatively like me, you realize that there are different roles, different moments in a person's life, that allow for that kind of expression. And I think we're in a very exciting moment in the sense that fashion for a long time was about the kind of clothing that we see on the screen, which is about a very narrow elite with trends that were projected from a very small number of designers, and that's changed. If you look in this room, you will not find two people who are dressed identically. And if you did, they'd probably sit at opposite corners of the room. So if anything, you always have the option of walking down the street in bicycle shorts without a shirt, but you're going to be perceived a certain way. And so that's what's exciting about clothing, is that you make these decisions, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, but the study of historic fashion just is a sort of foothold into bringing it back to yourself. What does clothing mean? And what do you intend to say by it? So, if everybody wanted to be natural, your definition of natural is probably different than mine. Mine would be a turtleneck sweater and a jumpsuit. Oh, yes.
I think I must be the one person here who lived through most of that. I've been with this museum over 55 years as a volunteer most of the time. And I was very much a part of the design laboratory when it was here with Bob Riley. Oh. And I did experience its transfer over to FIT. And I think the main reason for that was it wasn't just the top designers who wanted to use this laboratory and couldn't. It was the young upcoming designer who wanted to have access to, and there just wasn't enough space and time for it. So then it was unnatural that when the Institute started over at FIT, Bob Riley actually left here and went there because it was an opportunity for all the young people coming up in fashion, American young people as well, to have an opportunity to see some of these things, touch these things, and experience what they were. Now, FIT has taken on the laboratory part of it, really. Does the Met in the future have any intention of allowing young designers or designers to come and experience that?
We continue to do that. I mean, it's in a sense, until about a year ago when the two collections physically merged, we're going to have to accommodate this other collection. Our facilities right now date back to the early 1970s. And so we're embarking on a capital project which will not only create a modernized compact storage. We figured it out, I mean, my team has figured it out, that we can theoretically merge the two collections and be in the same space. It seems to me like it's one of those jack-in-the-box things where we're just compressing. But I've been told by our conservator and our collections manager that it is possible. Once that happens, we're reorganizing our space to return to what we had before, which we have study rooms where designers will come. They're all now, though, shepherded in a way that's very different than it was even when I was at FIT 20 years ago. There's a recognition that these pieces, every time they're handled, every time they're put on a mannequin, are being stressed. And so we're not limiting the access, but we're transforming the experience.
One other question. Will the Met continue to enlarge the collection when people wish to, in the past here, when people wish to donate something or contribute something to it, some fashion or some item that was of relevance, really, right. It was reviewed and accepted, if it was acceptable, really, to be part of the collection. And that's how the collection grew, too, from an individual contribution.
No, we've...
Do you still accept?
Yeah, we do. We're attempting to be much more focused in our new acquisitions, but I have to say, you know, it's sometimes with the best criteria and the most delimiting criteria, you're dealing with people who love clothes. So I'm afraid we haven't been disciplined enough, and we continue to be the one department that accepts more pieces than any other department in the institution.
Thanks, Belle. I also want to just say that when Bob Riley went with the collection to FIT, it was one of those moments, as I said, when we were changing our direction. And the design lab here had been very much the way you were describing the early costume collection at the Met, in that the design lab was a membership function, and many different design and production, costume, fashion and textile industries supported it. It was a kind of moneymaker, and there was a membership that was really pretty large and supported that group.
We're free.
Yeah, no, the design lab here was not. It was a membership organization.
And it was at FIT as well.
It was at FIT as well, exactly. Well, how did it work? That's right. It worked almost like a subscription library, that you had a membership in the design lab which allowed you to send your designers here to have access to the material.
Mr. Stayton?
Yes.
Could you speak a little bit more about the, I don't know if you call it the ethnology collection, because you shared that wonderful picture of the African Bonwit and the back and forth relationship. And if you're sort of, say African collection and North African is different from, say, I know you have a very important European peasant collection, and this is very early ethnography that was going on here.
Yes.
And how are you dealing with that?
I can. When we went into this project, we decided to confine it to the material that had been part of the costumes and textiles collection. The costumes and textiles collection had been defined over the years as essentially Western costume and textiles, European and American costumes and textiles. We have retained the textile part of that collection at the museum. We only discussed within that the costume part. And from the beginning, we made it clear that it did not include non-Western costumes. So our Asian costume, our African costume, all of the non-Western costume remains within the collections in the museum in which it has always resided. It's much smaller body of material. We understand that it is sort of arbitrary that we've drawn the lines there, that Asian costume and African costume could just as easily have been considered part of the costume collection as part of the African collection or part of the Asian collection. But it's partly based on history and partly based on the fact that we have different curatorial organizations for those collections. It is ironic that at a time when we really are trying to break down boundaries between collections and media and types, that we've continued to keep that particular boundary between costumes of the East and West. But it was an organizational way that made sense for what we were doing. And again, because we look at this so much as a collection sharing program in which we still have access to the materials, I feel like we haven't separated entirely the American and European costume from the African and Asian costume because they can rejoin in various configurations. The Western textiles are under the aegis of the Decorative Arts Department. Since many of them, since really most of the most important ones we have are domestic textiles, they're curtains, bed hangings, things like that, they fit very well into the Decorative Arts Department, much better than the costumes did.
And it's interesting because the Met, it would have been difficult for us to take on those costumes because the differentiation at the Met, and this seems completely arbitrary, but it's basically about the construction of the garment so that if you can store it flat, it ends up being in rati, and so if an extraordinary 17th century kimono comes in or an important Manchu robe, it doesn't come to us. It goes to the Asian Art Department. If an important African piece comes in, it goes to AAOA. So for different reasons, we've ended up with a collection that we really felt we could manage. We don't have the expertise for regional and ethnographic material.
I guess my question relates to the question before. Since the Brooklyn Museum collection, a lot of the impetus for it was to develop the American fashion industry, to help it grow. And there's a lot of American fashion in the collection, which was unique to Brooklyn. And will the Met be looking at that material with new eyes, or what are we to do in America because we need to be collecting the history of our own fashion industry. New York City is still a fashion city. Do you think that this new collaboration will involve maybe looking with new eyes at American things?
We're actually, we have a fellow who was part of the assessment project who is going to be doing specifically that. From the perspective of the editing of both of the collections before the merge, it seems to me that it's going to be predicated not simply because it happens to be a dressmaker who's in Brooklyn, but the quality of the object, whether or not it's something that is has some sort of a level of innovation, idiosyncrasy that makes it distinctive. If it looks like any other dress in the time made by a dressmaker, then it doesn't say very much about Brooklyn. It could have been on 34th Street in Manhattan. So it's going to be difficult judgments, but we are cognizant of the fact that there is a separate history to the Brooklyn collection that we don't want to subvert.
Hi. Being from a West Coast institution that also collects historic dress, I was wondering what might be happening to the pieces that the Met is now comparing with the Brooklyn pieces for possible deaccession, and what's going to happen to the Brooklyn pieces that are not retained, but then also conversely what's going to happen to the Met pieces that are not
There
retained.
are two different strategies. The Brooklyn pieces, most institutions, at least at the Met, if something is valued over a certain amount, the board requires that we offer it at auction. We can't do anything else to it. We have to offer it at auction. However, with costume pieces, because unless it's very exceptional, you never break the $15,000 mark. No matter how brilliant the Bonnie Cashin coat is, it's not going to break the $15,000 mark. So what we've decided with our own collection is whenever we've had to deaccession it, we have a partnership with Parsons, and so the pieces are transferred to Parsons because we feel that we had several donors, and in the correspondence history, they said, if you don't want it, we want it to go to a school. They did not want it to re-enter the market, and that became clear. So we thought that that was an elegant way for us to proceed. With the Brooklyn collection, we still feel that the pieces are the Brooklyns in a way. And so when we have elected to deaccession, for example, we've gone through the first phase where the assessment had designated almost 8,000 pieces for deaccessioning for various reasons. And we went through them. We actually withheld things that the assessment group felt because we knew what we had, and we said, this might not have been important in that context, but in the context of this larger merged collection, it's more important. So we've withheld things. Kevin has gone over anything that we've designated for deaccessioning from his collection, and he's spotted things that relate, again, to something intrinsic to the Brooklyn history. And so we have these screens. When the pieces are offered at auction, and there have already been three auctions, the proceeds go to Brooklyn. No money was exchanged in this process, but our feeling was that when pieces from the Brooklyn collection are sold, it really is the Brooklyn collection, so the proceeds go to Brooklyn.
Yeah, and I would just add that while this is incredibly generous and we can always use proceeds, it's been modest amounts of money, especially since we began with that group of material that really was pretty clearly not museum quality, that was badly damaged or was just not really very good. Certainly even with the things that our Brooklyn Museum collection being deaccessioned and sold, we would be completely open to transferring. As we move into the better material, we would be completely open to transferring it to other institutions because our whole process was because we believed that this should be in the public domain.
Like Pratt, I'm from an educational institution as well, and on the West Coast, we haven't seemed to have gotten very many early or even mid-19th century high fashion items, or at least they haven't survived to be donated. So I was hoping that perhaps
where there's an especial richness is in certain collections that in the lifetime of the American designer, and these are 20th century, that they had a kind of self-assessment that said their artistic production belonged to museums. So, for example, Vera Maxwell, Bonnie Cashin, to some extent Claire McCardle, but less so, gave substantial numbers of works to these different institutions within the New York metropolitan area. And because of that, there's a lot of redundant. So even though they're in great condition, they're actually extraordinary design pieces, we've been able to winnow it down to what we think is the most essential representation of those designers. And so there's been a lot of things. If one were a private collector or a smaller institution, I mean, I've called colleagues at in certain institutions, including the West Coast, because how many mohair coats with leather bindings are going to end up in Los Angeles? Very few. So I've alerted them to the fact that there's some really great mid-century modernist American sportswear pieces that are coming up at auction.
Great. Thanks.
We want it all to end up in the right place.
Here's my frustration. You mentioned the Schiaparellis that the Philadelphia Museum owns, And I, as an ordinary museum goer, I take the train tomorrow to go down and see them, but I know this much, that probably they're not on view, and might not be on view in my lifetime, actually. Do you ever foresee the day that that there's not a wing, that would be too much, I guess, but that there is space devoted to an effort to present fashion on a day in, day out basis, the way people can go to see the Impressionists, you know?
I'm sure Harold will have something to say about the Met, but that exact thing is one of the reasons that we were having so much trouble with the costume collection here, is that as we get more professional about how we treat these things, it becomes more and more difficult to do exactly what you're asking. And people do want to see the costumes. People did want to see the costumes at Brooklyn, but because they have to be rotated, because they're very costly to put out, their material sort of prohibited us from doing constantly changing exhibitions. There are other kinds of materials in museums that are like that. Prints and drawings have to be rotated, photographs have to be rotated, but they're easier to do than costumes. And the frustration that you're feeling that we couldn't provide an ongoing exhibition of costumes for people all the time was one of the reasons why we sort of re-examined that collection.
And while the experience doesn't even begin on the most superficial level to be the same as actually looking at the object, one of the benefits of the photography project is that at least there's a sense of what the collection contains. And so you see this huge menu of objects that you can, we've gotten, when we did a show called Blog Mode, we were getting responses from Eastern Europe, from Southeast Asia, 2 a.m., you know, that once you're on the web, there's a kind of access that is, again, not like proximity to the actual object, but at least it begins to be more material out there, more information out there than was previously available. The one institution that I think is making a really good faith attempt to have a kind of ongoing representation of costume is FIT. And they're doing it in a way that we experimented with it, but it wasn't successful for us, which is to take thematic shows, so interpret your body of the collection and highlight different areas of it through themes. We found very quickly that at a certain point, if you wanted to show the very best representation of something, whether or not it was the silhouette of the 1890s or textile techniques in, you know, the turn of the century, that you were going back to the same objects, if you wanted to present what was actually the best. And so even the strategy of conceiving of new themes in which to highlight different zones of the collection ended up being one that was stressing the collection. So we stopped. FIT seems to have done a very successful job of rethinking that and highlighting objects that one would not normally see in the masterworks of the 20th century, but, you know, but allow the public a view into the small eddies of their collection that would not normally be seen. And so that is one strategy. One of the exciting technical innovations that is now emerging is the use of LEDs. And people were always talking about this, and I thought, oh, it just seems like a gimmick. But I've seen several of the manufacturers, and they've now virtually been able to eliminate all UV on the spectrum. So if they continue this kind of process, we'll be able to mount things for longer, and perhaps that will address some of your concerns. I just give you as a sign of the problem, the challenge we have is the Victoria and Albert's dress court had extraordinary pieces which were a timeline of their best representations back to the 17th century. When they took them down after 12 years, some of the things can't be shown ever again. They're just in such a state of fragility and destruction. So it's a real concern. It's not empty. but it's part of our capital plans. Once we merge the two collections physically, we're actually going to be able to tease out more space for a gallery, which will be up 365 days a year. One of the exciting things about any costume collection for any institution is that you have a public that is constantly interested in visiting that particular area. And we find from our visitor services, after the bathrooms and impressionist art, we're the most requested department. And we're down for 3/4 of the year. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yes, thank you.